He thought he was chopping an ordinary tree, but what fell out from inside changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning always came too early for Melvin. Long before the sun pushed its first pale thread over the horizon, he was already awake, lying in the creaking narrow bed that had shaped itself to his tired body over the years. The house around him was still and cold, its thin wooden walls holding on to the night's chill as if afraid to let go. For a few moments he remained motionless, listening to the quiet hum of dawn settling over the poor rural stretch he had called home his entire life. There were no soft footsteps of children, no warm rustle of a loving wife preparing breakfast, no sign of a world that wanted him. Only the faint whistle of the wind dragging itself through the cracks near the window and the echo of his own heartbeat. He rose without ceremony, as he always did, and lit the small lantern hanging from a nail beside the door. Its soft glow revealed the familiar emptiness of the single room he shared with his wife: a chipped table, a few mismatched dishes, an old stove that worked only when it pleased, and a pair of boots worn down to the shape of his feet. His whole life seemed to exist in that same state, patched together, barely holding, carrying marks of long seasons of struggle. The world had given him nothing easily, not warmth, not comfort, not respect, but it had given him endurance, the one thing he never allowed anyone to take from him. He splashed cold water onto his face from the metal basin. The shock wakened the last bits of sleep from his eyes. He did not linger in the silence. There was no point in delaying what needed to be done, what had always needed to be done. Melvin was a man who worked because life had left him no other path. He had learned young that survival was not granted. It was earned corner by corner, scar by scar, blow by blow of the axe that hung by the door. The axe had been his father's once, its wooden handle smoothed by 2 generations of hands that had known more hardship than comfort. When Melvin wrapped his fingers around it, it felt like gripping the only truthful thing he had ever known. He stepped outside. The air carried the sharp bite of early morning, tasting of soil and distant pine. Dew shimmered on the grass, though half of the blades were broken or dead. His small plot of land had never been fertile, but he maintained it as best he could, clearing weeds, repairing fences, patching the sagging roof of the storage shed that looked as though one strong wind could knock it over. It was enough to keep him busy, enough to keep his hands moving so his mind would not drown in thoughts he could not afford. A faint light flickered through the house window behind him. He turned slightly, catching sight of the thin silhouette of his wife, Tara, moving past the curtain. She did not come out to see him off. She never did. Over the years, the warmth in her eyes had dried up like a neglected well. There had been a time when she smiled, when she believed he would build something better, when she saw in him not just a man with an axe, but a man with a future. But dreams had proven to be more fragile than the brittle boards of their home. Life had chipped away at her hope until only sharpness remained, directed at him whenever she was tired or hungry or disappointed, which was often. Melvin faced the path stretching toward the woods and started walking. The worn earth beneath his boots told the story of countless mornings like this, the same route taken day after day, season after season, a path that had known all his disappointments and all his attempts to rise above them. His posture was steady and unhurried, shaped not by confidence but by acceptance. He knew that whatever happened beyond the tree line, he would meet it head-on. Pain was familiar, hardship was familiar, work was the only constant. The forest welcomed him with a chorus of rustling leaves, distant bird calls and the murmur of branches brushing against each other in the shifting breeze. The woods were his sanctuary, the only place where he felt he belonged. Here, no one judged him. No one looked at him with condescension or disappointment. Trees did not care whether a man was poor, whether his house was falling apart, or whether his wife blamed him for every misfortune. Trees only cared for the strength of his swing and the steadiness of his breath. He found his usual spot deeper in the forest, a clearing where fallen timber lay thick from the storms of past years. The air smelled of damp bark, soil, and the promise of honest labor. Melvin removed the rag from the axe blade, gripping the handle tightly. His first swing cut through the air with the familiar whistling sound, striking deep into the trunk of a downed pine. The vibration ran up his arms and settled into his bones. It was a sensation he had felt so many times that he no longer noticed the sting. Blow after blow, the rhythm consumed him, pushing everything else from his mind. The arguments, the hunger, the mocking looks from relatives who had found easier, less honest ways to make a living. For a while, he was free, absorbed in the simplicity of effort and progress. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, flooding the clearing with warm light. Sweat soaked through his shirt, dripped down his jaw, soaked into the earth beneath his boots. He paused only when his vision blurred from exhaustion. He wiped his forehead, took a few deep breaths, and continued, gathering cut branches, splitting logs, tying them into bundles with coarse rope. Each completed bundle was a victory no one saw, a quiet triumph that belonged only to him. When the afternoon came, he made his way to the small town's market. Vendors shouted, children ran between stalls, chickens squawked from cages, and somewhere an old radio played a song almost drowned out by the noise. Melvin set his bundled firewood down in his usual spot by the well. He did not call out to potential customers. His presence barely registered to most people as they passed by, sometimes avoiding eye contact as if poverty were contagious. Those who did stop often haggled aggressively, trying to drive down a price already too low. He never argued. He needed the money more than his pride. By the time the sun began to dip toward the hills, he had sold enough bundles to earn a few dollars. It wasn't much, not enough for comfort, barely enough for necessity, but it was something. Enough to buy a bit of bread, a sack of beans, and maybe some old vegetables from the vendor who pitied him. Melvin walked home slow and heavy, carrying food that was supposed to feel like a prize but rarely did. He reached his house, worn down as always, the paint peeling in thin flakes like old scabs. He stepped through the door and saw Tara waiting inside. Her expression was taut, her eyes sharp with an emotion he had grown used to naming, but never fully confronting. Disappointment, anger, resentment, perhaps all three. She looked at the food he brought as if expecting more, as if expecting him to produce miracles out of thin air. He placed the small groceries on the counter, hoping for silence, but the air thickened instead. She crossed her arms, glanced around the house, the broken chair, the cupboard missing a hinge, the single light bulb flickering overhead. Then she looked at him, and he could feel the weight of years pressing down. All the hopes she once had evaporated, leaving only bitterness behind. Her words cut into him, not as sudden blows, but as familiar wounds reopened again and again. He had no answers to give her, no promises he could keep, no dream big enough to chase. He looked at his hands, hands that had built nothing but bundles of wood, hands that had never known rest. In them, she saw failure. In them, he saw the only truth he had left. The argument did not explode. It simmered, sharp and quiet, a breaking point disguised as another evening in a long line of disappointing evenings. But this time, something changed. Tara reached the end of her patience, her voice rising with controlled fury and with a sudden, irreversible finality. She told him to leave. He stood frozen for a moment, wondering if he had misheard. He hadn't. The door behind him suddenly felt too close, the house too small to hold both of them. She pointed toward it, her jaw clenched. There was nothing left for him to say. The world had spoken for her. Melvin stepped outside. The air was colder than before, though the night had not yet fully fallen. Behind him, the door shut with a soft but decisive thud. A boundary drawn, a life closed. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground as if expecting it to open and swallow him whole. But the earth did not move. It simply waited, just as it had always waited for him to take the next step. He picked up his axe, the one thing he trusted, and walked toward the only place that had ever held him without judgment. The forest. His path was slow, weighted by the realization that he no longer had a home to return to. Yet something else stirred beneath the grief, a faint, barely audible whisper, a call he could not yet understand. The trees loomed closer, their dark silhouettes merging with the gathering dusk, offering solace in their ancient stillness. As he entered the woods, the world behind him faded into obscurity. Ahead lay nothing but shadows, solitude, and the faint hope that tomorrow would be different, though every day of his life had proved otherwise. Still, he walked. The forest accepted him once more, and though he did not know it, with the next swing of his axe, his fate would twist in a way no one in that small, unkind town could ever imagine. The night deepened, cloaking the trees in darkness. Melvin pressed on, unaware that he was approaching the very place where the story of his old life would end and the story of his new one would begin. The path was unknown, but he carried the same enduring resolve he always had. Tomorrow he would face the forest again. Tomorrow the axe would rise and fall, and with it the world would shift in ways he could not yet see. And so, the first chapter of his quiet, burdened life began to lean toward a new season, one shaped not by despair, but by an unexpected truth waiting beneath the bark of an ancient tree. The forest had always been a place where Melvin could hide from the noise of the world, but that night it felt different. The darkness pressed against him like a living thing, not threatening, but waiting. As he walked deeper beneath the towering silhouettes of oak and pine, the weight of his exile slowly settled into his bones. He had expected the breaking point to come someday, yet when it arrived it felt unreal, as though he were acting out someone else's fate. The emptiness at his back, the house that no longer welcomed him, the wife who had closed her heart long before she closed the door, seemed to detach from him with each step. Ahead lay a path he had walked 1,000 times, but tonight it felt strangely foreign, carved by hands other than his own. He reached a cluster of trees where he often paused during the day, a natural clearing bordered by tangled roots and moss-darkened stones. The moon had begun to rise, casting a dim glow along the forest floor, streaking the grass with silver. It wasn't much light, but enough to keep him from tripping over the branches that snaked across the earth like sleeping serpents. He lowered himself onto a fallen log, setting the axe against his knee, and for a long time he simply sat there, letting the silence hold him. The forest was never truly quiet. There were crickets, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant hoot of an owl. But compared to the household he had left, this stillness was pure, almost sacred. His breath escaped him in a long, steady sigh. He wasn't a man prone to tears, but the heaviness behind his eyes reminded him of the years he had spent pretending that endurance alone could fix everything. Now there was no one to pretend for. The weight lifted, leaving behind only exhaustion and a strange clarity. He looked down at his hands, at the rough skin, the scars, the thickened knuckles. They were the hands of a man who had never stopped trying, even when the world decided he had nothing left to offer. The air grew colder as the night deepened. Melvin knew he needed shelter, some place to rest before the dawn's work began again. He rose from the fallen log, feeling the ache in his back and legs, and began walking deeper into the woods, following no particular direction. His steps were slow but steady, guided more by instinct than purpose. After what felt like an hour or more, his eyes caught the faint outline of a crumbling hunting shack half hidden behind undergrowth. He remembered it vaguely from his childhood, long abandoned, a ruin of tilting walls and a roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Yet, tonight it was enough. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and rot, but it sheltered him from the biting wind. He gathered stray branches and dried brush from beneath the shack's eaves and managed to coax a small fire to life in the broken stone hearth. The flames flickered unsteadily, but their warmth spread through the narrow room like a blessing. He sat by the glow, hugging his knees, letting the heat creep into his numb fingers. He did not allow himself to sleep fully, just drifted in and out of shallow rest, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. When dawn finally came, the forest awoke with a low hum. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the shack's roof, dappling the floor with patches of gold. Melvin rose stiffly, stamping life back into his legs, gathering his axe once more. Whatever grief he had carried into the forest the night before, the morning stripped it down to something simpler. His life was still his, regardless of who had cast him out. Work awaited him, and with it, a small measure of purpose. If nothing else, the world could not take that from him. He stepped into the daylight, drawing in a long breath of crisp, cool air. The woods glowed under the rising sun, the trunks of the trees stretching upward like ancient pillars. Ahead of him, further than he usually ventured, a massive oak towered above its neighbors. He had seen it before in passing, but had never approached it closely. It was enormous, at least twice the width of the surrounding trees, its bark thick, ridged, and marked with deep scars of storms long past. Its roots twisted across the earth in sprawling coils, gripping the ground with the stubbornness of something that refused to fall even under the cruelty of time. Melvin could not explain why he felt drawn to it now, only that his feet moved toward it with a strange sense of inevitability. Standing before the oak, he felt a quiet reverence, as though he were in the presence of something ancient and wise. This tree had outlived generations. It had felt the thunder of hooves from travelers long gone, had weathered the Civil War battles rumored to have passed through these woods, had endured every summer drought and winter storm without surrender. Something about its unwavering presence stirred a faint spark inside him, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could endure too. It wasn't a practical choice for firewood. The wood was too dense, too old, too much trouble to work with. Years ago, when he first tried to cut it, his axe barely bit into the bark before the reverberation stung his hand so sharply that he backed away, muttering to himself that some trees simply weren't meant to be touched. Since then, he had avoided it, treating it almost like a boundary marker. But today was different. Today, he no longer cared about the difficulty of the task. He only needed something to do, something to focus on, something that could drown out the echo of Tara's voice and the hollow feeling inside his chest. He tightened his grip on the axe, lifted it high over his head, and swung with all the strength left in him. The blade struck the bark with a heavy thud, sending a familiar jolt up his arms. He swung again, harder this time, the vibration stinging but manageable. Blow after blow, he struck the oak, letting the rhythm settle into him, letting the effort burn through the layers of sorrow and confusion that clung to him like a second skin. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cool morning air. His breath turned ragged, clouds forming each time he exhaled. With every swing, memories surfaced. The first time his father had taught him to hold an axe, the hot summer days spent splitting wood behind the house he grew up in, the feeling of pride when he chopped his first full stack by himself. That pride had faded since then, buried under years of mockery and failure, but the memory of it lingered, as strong and stubborn as the oak before him. Then, suddenly, the rhythm broke. The axe struck something that did not sound like wood. Instead of the dull, fibrous thump of bark and trunk, a metallic clang rang out, sharp and unmistakable. The vibration that traveled up his arms felt different too, hollow, almost foreign. Melvin paused, lowering the axe slowly, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he wondered if exhaustion had tricked his senses. He wiped his brow, adjusted his stance, and swung again. The metallic sound returned, louder this time. He stepped back, heart pounding a little faster. He looked closely at the gash he had carved into the tree. Beneath the thick bark and layers of aged wood, something dark and unnatural glimmered faintly. He narrowed his eyes, leaning closer, scraping away fragments of bark with the tip of the axe. There, embedded within the tree itself, was the corner of something man-made. Curiosity overcame fatigue. He placed the axe aside and pried at the wood with his hands, pulling away pieces of splintered bark and fibrous inner layers. The oak resisted, its innards clinging together with the stubbornness of centuries, but something had taken root inside it long before Melvin ever walked these woods. Slowly, carefully, he widened the opening until he could reach inside. His fingers brushed against something soft yet firm, rough with age, like weathered leather. His heart lurched. He pulled gently, and a small portion of a leather bag came into view, wedged deep within the hollow that time and nature had carved out. How long had it been there? Who had placed it? Why inside a tree? Questions ignited in his mind, but instinct told him to continue. With both hands, he gripped what he could of the bag and tugged. It resisted at first, trapped by decades, maybe centuries of pressure from the growing trunk, but inch by inch it loosened, until with a final heave, it came free, sending him stumbling back onto the ground. He stared at the object in his hands, chest heaving. The leather sack was darkened, stiff and cracking, the stitching frayed but still intact. It felt heavier than it should have for its size. For a moment, Melvin simply held it, unsure whether he wanted to open it. Something about the weight, the secrecy of its hiding place, the metallic sound, none of it felt ordinary. The forest around him seemed to hush, as if watching. He loosened the cord binding the top of the sack, fingers trembling slightly. When he pulled it open and looked inside, the breath caught in his chest as though someone had reached into him and taken hold of his lungs. Gold. The light of the morning sun struck the contents of the bag, illuminating a pile of old coins, their edges worn, their surfaces bearing the faded markings of long-gone eras. Mixed among them were pieces of jewelry, thick rings set with discolored stones, brooches fashioned in styles no one wore anymore, necklaces with broken clasps. He saw small chains, lockets, and even a tarnished silver cup engraved with initials he didn't recognize. Everything was layered in dust, as though the forest itself had been guarding this treasure for longer than anyone could remember. For a moment, Melvin could not move. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the sight was too surreal, too impossible. He dug his fingers into the bag, letting the coins spill through them with a soft, clinking whisper. They were real. The metal was cold, solid, heavy. He held one up to the light, tracing its worn emblem with his thumb. It looked old, older than any coin he had ever seen. Civil War era, perhaps, or even earlier. How had they come to be hidden inside an oak tree? He thought of stories he had heard in childhood, tales of outlaws who fled through these forests, of runaway slaves who hid their few valuables in hollow trees before escaping north, of bandits who buried plundered goods in places they hoped to claim later. The truth of the treasure's origin remained a mystery, but one thing was clear. It had been meant to stay hidden. Time had swallowed it, and only chance or fate had brought him to it now. Melvin glanced around the forest, half expecting someone to step out from behind the trees and accuse him of theft. But the woods were silent, the only witnesses the leaves trembling gently in the morning breeze. He felt a strange mixture of wonder and fear rush through him. After a lifetime of scraping by, of being looked down upon, of being told he was worthless, hopeless, destined for nothing more than the next falling tree, here, in his hands, lay enough wealth to change everything. Yet the thought frightened him. Wealth could lift a man, but it could also destroy him. He had seen enough of people's greed to know that no treasure came without danger. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the sack, tied it shut, and held it tightly against his chest. The forest seemed to breathe again, the tension easing, but Melvin's pulse remained rapid. He knew instinctively that he could tell no one. Not Tara, not his relatives, not the neighbors who barely acknowledged him. No one could know what he had found. To speak of it would invite suspicion, envy, and destruction. Instead, he looked for a place to hide the bag. Near the roots of the oak, he found a shallow space where the earth had softened from years of rain. Kneeling, he dug with his hands, pushing aside soil and fallen leaves until he created a small hollow. He placed the treasure inside, covering it carefully, making sure no hint of disturbance remained. When he stood again, the tree loomed above him, its bark scarred by his axe. He touched the trunk gently, almost as though thanking it. There was a strange sensation in the air, a quiet acceptance that something monumental had just occurred, like a doorway had opened, waiting for him to decide whether to step through. Melvin wiped the dirt from his hands, lifted his axe, and took a step back from the oak. The day suddenly felt brighter. The weight of the world that had pressed so heavily on his shoulders the night before seemed to ease, replaced not with relief, but with possibility. He didn't know what he would do yet, didn't know how to navigate a life that might be different from the one he'd known, but he felt a spark, a faint but undeniable hope that maybe he wasn't doomed to be the man everyone said he was. He began walking back toward the abandoned shack, toward the rest of the forest, toward a future he couldn't yet imagine. Behind him, the oak stood silent and immovable, guarding the secret it had kept for generations, now entrusted to him alone. As Melvin disappeared into the trees, the first chapter of his life faded into memory, and a new chapter, one forged by chance courage, and the weight of hidden gold began to unfold, guiding him toward the path he never knew he could walk. In the days that followed, the forest seemed different to Melvin, as though every shadow carried a secret only he and the ancient oak now shared. He moved through the trees with a heightened awareness, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of what rested beneath the earth. The image of the gold-filled sack haunted him in a way that felt both exhilarating and unsettling. It was not the sight of wealth itself that lingered in his mind, but the knowledge that the course of his life had shifted silently, without witnesses, without ceremony. He carried the awareness like a new pulse beneath his skin, something beating quietly alongside his own heart. When he returned to the abandoned shack that first morning, the fire from the previous night had smoldered down to ash. The emptiness inside the structure mirrored the emptiness he had once felt in his chest. But something was different now. The man who stepped into that shack had been beaten down by years of disappointment. The man who stepped out carried a secret capable of changing everything. Yet, he did not rush toward his new future. He sat on the rickety stool by the faded wall and spent nearly an hour in silence, letting the reality settle into him fully. He understood instinctively that haste would ruin him. Wealth was not a gift to be flaunted. It was a test, and only patience could help him pass it. He left the shack later that morning and returned to the oak tree one more time. Kneeling before the spot where he had buried the treasure, he ran his fingertips over the soil, making sure the ground bore no signs of disturbance. The forest had already begun its quiet work of covering his tracks. Fallen leaves had drifted into place, masking the edges of the shallow burial. The opening in the tree trunk where the sack had been lodged still gaped like an old wound, but Melvin covered it with a patch of bark and moss, blending it seamlessly into the oak's textured surface. When he stepped back, even he could barely tell something had once been there. Only after he felt confident in the secrecy of the site did he return to the small market town. He did not walk with a renewed pride or arrogance. Instead, he kept his steps slow, deliberate, conscious of the role he still had to play. His life could not change overnight. If it did, people would notice. People would talk. And people talking was the greatest danger of all. He sold his firewood as usual that day, the bundles stacked neatly beside him. Some customers nodded politely, though most paid little mind to him. He accepted their indifference with the same quiet resignation he always had, even as the knowledge of what lay buried beneath the oak tree pulsed like a secret flame beneath his ribs. When he counted his meager earnings at the end of the day, he did so without frustration. He knew now that this money was no longer the boundary of his life. It was merely one brick in a foundation he was beginning to build. That evening, instead of returning to the house he no longer called home, he made his way back into the woods. He found a spot near the shack and built a small shelter of his own, using fallen branches, cut pine, and old boards he scavenged from a collapsed fence nearby. It wasn't much, just a slanted roof of wood, a floor of packed earth, and enough room to lie down. But it was his. He felt no bitterness about sleeping alone under a roof not meant for any comfort. His heart had grown so accustomed to hardship that a roof of any kind felt like a blessing. And now, with the hidden treasure close by, the forest felt safer than any house he had ever lived in. The next morning began like countless mornings before it, except for one thing. Melvin had a plan. He made his way back toward town, his steps quick and energized by a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. He carried his axe as usual, but his gaze was sharper, his posture more grounded. Before entering the marketplace, he detoured toward a small shop owned by a man named Peterson, a quiet jeweler known for paying fairly for old scraps of metal and broken bits of jewelry. Peterson was the kind of man who didn't ask unnecessary questions, the kind of man who minded his own business as long as the price was right. Melvin stood outside the shop for several minutes, gathering his courage. He reached into his pocket, where he carried a single object wrapped in cloth. He felt the shape of the coin inside through the fabric, its edges smooth and aged. He had chosen it carefully the night before, selecting one that looked worn but valuable enough to fetch a reasonable price without drawing attention. Inside the shop, the musty smell of tarnished silver and old velvet greeted him. Peterson sat by the counter, polishing a small brass brooch. He looked up as Melvin entered, mildly surprised but not suspicious. Melvin laid the wrapped coin gently on the counter. When Peterson unfolded the cloth, his eyes narrowed, not in greed, but in curiosity. He examined the coin under a magnifying glass, turning it over, noting its faded insignia. "Found it while cleaning out an old field," Melvin said simply, keeping his voice steady. He offered no extra details. He knew better than to give more information than necessary. Peterson nodded, satisfied enough with the explanation. After a moment of silent calculation, he offered an amount that made Melvin's breath hitch, not because it was an enormous sum, but because it was more money than he usually made in a week. Melvin accepted without hesitation, tucking the cash into his pocket and leaving the shop with a small but significant step toward his new life. With the money, he bought only what he needed: some nails, a few boards, a sturdy saw, and a handful of good quality sandpaper. He also purchased a loaf of bread, a sack of beans, and a bit of cured meat, enough to last him several days. No one in the market suspected anything unusual. He had not done anything extraordinary. He was still the quiet woodcutter who kept to himself. Returning to the forest, Melvin began the work that would shape the next phase of his life. He spent days repairing the abandoned shack, strengthening the walls, patching the roof, replacing loose planks with new ones. With each improvement, the place felt less like a forgotten ruin and more like a workshop waiting to be revived. He reinforced the hearth so it could hold a proper fire, cleaned the floor of debris, and built a makeshift workbench from a fallen tree trunk. His movements were guided not by desperation now, but by steady determination, as though his hands instinctively knew what they were meant to create. By the end of the week, the shack had transformed into a small, functional workshop. Melvin tested the saw he had bought, its blade slicing cleanly through the wood. He carved simple shapes at first: small wooden spoons, short planks, sturdy handles for tools. Then, as his confidence grew, he crafted a stool with a sanded, smooth seat and carefully measured legs. The work soothed him in a way nothing else ever had. He found rhythm in shapen wood, peace in the sound of shaven curls falling to the ground. His hands understood wood in a way they did not understand people. In the town, whispers began to stir. People noticed that Melvin was fixing up the old shack, a place most had forgotten or assumed would fall apart within the year. Some wondered why he bothered. Some speculated that he simply had nowhere else to go. But curiosity never grew strong enough to become suspicion. Melvin had always been a quiet man, and no one imagined he could be anything else. He continued selling firewood, though now he produced furniture as well. His first stools were simple but well made, and when he carried them to the market, a few people stopped to ask about them. The price he offered was modest, much lower than the pieces deserved, but the low price drew interest. Within days, all the stools were sold. Melvin reinvested the earnings in better tools and wood supplies, never touching the treasure unless absolutely necessary. One morning, as he arranged the stools and wooden spoons on his blanket in the marketplace, an older woman approached him. She examined the pieces with a careful, experienced eye, and then asked if he could build a small table for her kitchen. Her voice held neither pity nor mockery, only respect for the craftsmanship. Melvin agreed, and for the first time in many years he felt a swell of pride, small but enduring, like an ember catching flame. Word spread slowly but steadily. People began to say that the man who lived out in the woods made honest pieces that lasted. They said his firewood burned longer, that his stools never wobbled, that his simple kindness warmed the cold spaces of the community. A reputation was forming, not of wealth, but of reliability, of integrity, of quiet skill. Meanwhile, his former wife, Tara, heard whispers of his progress. At first, she dismissed them as exaggeration. Later, she grew uneasy, resentful even, that he seemed to be rising from the ashes of the life she had cast him out of. But pride kept her at a distance. She wanted to see for herself, but could not bring herself to face the man she had rejected with such finality. Instead, she listened from afar, gathering pieces of information from gossiping neighbors and passing comments in the market. Melvin, for his part, thought of her only occasionally, and when he did, it was not with bitterness. He had been hurt deeply, yes, but the wound had begun to close, not because time healed it, but because the forest, the work, and the hidden treasure had given him something bigger than pain. Purpose. Month after month passed in this quiet rhythm. He sold just enough gold to sustain his workshop's growth, never more than needed. Each coin sold represented one step forward, but he was careful not to sprint. The forest had given him this gift. He owed it steadiness. By early winter, the workshop had expanded. He added a second table, shelves filled with tools and wood, and a small sleeping area with a real mattress he purchased from a traveling merchant. He hired a young man named Chris who had recently lost his job and needed work. Chris was awkward at first, unsure of how to interact with a man who seemed both stern and gentle at once, but Melvin taught him the craft patiently. Soon the two had a rhythm, working side by side in the glow of lantern light, shaping wood into something useful and sometimes even beautiful. The forest outside their door was often covered in frost now, its branches glittering in the morning sun, but inside the workshop warmth radiated from the hearth, mingling with the scent of sawdust and pine. Melvin would pause sometimes, listening to the steady scraping of Chris's plane against wood, and feel something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. The treasure beneath the oak had not just changed his future. It had awakened a part of him he had forgotten existed, a part that wanted to create, to build, to lift not only himself but others. He still kept the secret guarded with fierce caution, but as the workshop grew, as Chris found gratitude in the work, as the townspeople began to nod to him instead of looking through him, Melvin realized something profound. He was no longer the man who lived by the axe. He was a man building a life. The oak tree's secret remained safe for now, preserved in the quiet soil where only he could find it. Melvin's transformation unfolded slowly, like winter thawing into spring. And though the world had not yet noticed the change in him, it soon would. The first small ripples of his rebirth were already spreading through the town, and before long they would reach people who had never imagined that Melvin, the poor woodcutter, could become anything more. What Melvin did not know yet was that success, no matter how quiet, attracts attention he had never sought and was not prepared for. His rise had been built carefully, brick by brick, coin by coin, act of kindness by act of kindness. But as winter deepened and whispers traveled, there were eyes beginning to turn toward him, eyes filled not with admiration, but with suspicion. And so, as the last weeks of winter crept in, carrying the promise of challenges he had not yet foreseen, Melvin continued working in the workshop he had built from ruin, unaware that the hidden treasure was not the only secret the forest would soon force him to confront. Winter settled over the region with a slow, deliberate weight, covering the forest in white and wrapping the small town in an uneasy stillness. Yet, inside Melvin's workshop, life continued to stir. The crackle of the fire, the rasp of a plane smoothing rough planks, the rhythmic thud of a mallet. These sounds created a warmth that resisted the cold pressing in from outside. The workshop had become a refuge not only for Melvin, but for the few workers who found purpose within its walls. Chris had grown more confident, his hands steadier, his movements sure. Another young man, Aaron, had recently joined them, eager to learn whatever Melvin was willing to teach. Their presence filled the space with quiet camaraderie, and the small building glowed with a spirit of honest labor. But beyond the forest, beyond the humble sanctuary Melvin had built, the rhythms of the town were beginning to change. People noticed things, small things at first, barely worth mentioning. The old shack that had been abandoned for decades now had smoke curling from its chimney. More bundles of wood appeared in the market, neatly tied and of notably better quality. Simple furniture, chairs, stools, shelves, made their way into town homes, each piece carrying the unmistakable mark of craftsmanship people would later recognize as Melvin's signature. And though he remained humble, quiet, unassuming, the transformation around him was too clear to ignore. Like the first tremors before a storm, whispers stirred. It began with idle curiosity, spoken in low tones between vendors as they unpacked their crates in the morning. "He's doing well these days, isn't he?" someone would say. "Better than he's ever done." Another would shrug, saying it was about time his hard work amounted to something. But beneath that surface-level goodwill lay something far more dangerous: suspicion. Not everyone in the town understood or accepted the idea of good fortune that came from persistence. Many were too accustomed to shortcuts, too ready to assume dishonesty where they could not comprehend success. The shift became more apparent one cold market morning when Melvin carried a new table into the town square. It was modest, crafted from smooth pine and stained a warm honey color, but it carried an elegance that belied its simplicity. A few people stopped to admire it. A woman asked if she could place an order for a larger table. A man complimented the precision of the joints. Melvin received their words with quiet gratitude, his reserved smile acknowledging their praise without inviting further conversation. But a little distance away, a pair of men watched him with narrowed eyes, their murmured conversation interrupted by glances that held more malice than curiosity. Melvin didn't notice them at first. He had spent most of his life unnoticed, blending into the background as naturally as the trees in the forest. But these men, Tobias and Brent, did not see him as a harmless woodcutter anymore. They saw a man whose success had come too quickly, whose confidence seemed to expand in ways they could not accept. They whispered about how he used to barely get by, how his wife had thrown him out, how he had lived in near poverty for years. And now, suddenly, he was producing furniture, hiring workers, and repairing an old shack no one had cared about. To men like them, such transformation could only be the result of something hidden, something unnatural, or something illegal. Their murmurs spread through the market faster than Melvin could have imagined. Soon, others began to look at him differently. Not openly, not with direct challenges, but with the lingering gaze of those who wonder, those who doubt. A woman asked Chris one day where the wood they used came from. Chris, unaware of any suspicion, simply answered that they sourced fallen timber from deep within the woods. Another man asked Melvin directly how he'd learned to craft furniture so well. Melvin answered honestly. He had learned slowly, from trial and error, from memories of his father's hands guiding him, from necessity more than skill. But the man's expression carried a skeptical frown, as though the truth were too simple to believe. These suspicions would have fizzled out eventually, fading from lack of substance, if not for one man, Derek Hollis. Derek was known throughout the town as a man who tolerated no competition, no threats to the comfortable power he wielded. His father had owned several shops, and when Derek inherited them, he expanded the family's influence through intimidation and cunning rather than skill or integrity. He controlled prices, pressured vendors, and manipulated customers with quiet ruthlessness. People did business with him not because they liked him, but because he was the easiest path, or the only one. For years, he had regarded Melvin as irrelevant, a man too insignificant to warrant even a passing thought. But as winter progressed and Melvin's presence grew, subtle, steady, undeniable, Derek's indifference hardened into disdain. Melvin's growing reputation irritated him like a stone inside a boot. A man like Melvin had no right to rise, not in Derek's territory, not without permission he had never received. And it wasn't just Melvin's progress that angered him, it was the praise. People talking about how honest he was, how hard-working, how fair in price, how unfailingly respectful. These were qualities Derek lacked and detested in others. One evening, Derek visited the market just as the vendors were packing up their stalls. He passed by Melvin's booth, eyeing the furniture with an air of mocking scrutiny. Melvin nodded, offering a courteous greeting, but Derek responded with nothing more than a cold smirk. He stood there for several minutes, arms crossed, his gaze drifting back and forth between Melvin's workmanship and the subdued but growing admiration on the customers' faces. By the time he walked away, a decision had settled inside him like a stone sinking through water. The next morning, rumors spread with renewed intensity. Some said Melvin had come into an inheritance he was trying to hide. Others claimed he had found something valuable in the forest. Old coins, treasure, maybe illicit goods left behind by someone who had died or disappeared. No one knew where the story had originated, but many assumed it came from someone who knew more than they were saying. Derek's men, loyal only out of fear and profit, whispered these ideas into the ears of anyone who would listen. And people listened. Melvin felt the shift before he fully understood it. At first, it was simply the wary glance from a neighbor who normally greeted him with a nod. Then it was the way some customers lingered too long near his booth, not to admire the furniture, but to study him. The questions became more pointed. Someone asked how he could afford new tools. Another wondered aloud how he managed to rebuild the shack so quickly. People who had once ignored him now watched him as though waiting for him to betray some truth they already believed existed. Melvin kept his composure, though unease began to worm its way into his thoughts. He did not blame people for their curiosity. Poverty was a rigid language in small towns, and anyone who dared to change the script inevitably stirred suspicion. Yet, he knew that suspicion was a spark, and if Derek continued fanning the flames, It could turn into a fire he might not be able to control. One evening, as Melvin and Chris worked late in the shop, shaping the legs of a new table, Chris paused and looked up with furrowed brows. "People are saying things," he began gently, his tone hesitant. Melvin lifted his gaze, waiting. "About how you got all this. About the money." Melvin's hands stilled. He leaned back slightly, the shadows from the hearth dancing across the walls. "What kind of things?" Chris hesitated before continuing. "Some think you found something valuable." He paused again, not wanting to accuse or pry. "I told them it's none of their business, but people talk." Melvin nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind the young man's concern. He had hoped his careful pace, selling only one coin at a time, keeping his spending modest, would keep any unwanted attention at bay. But even the faintest change in a poor man's life was enough to ignite the curiosity of those who had never known his struggles. He reassured Chris as best he could, insisting that honesty and hard work built everything in the shop. It wasn't a lie. Those things had built more of his life than any treasure ever could. But he felt a sting of guilt for the truth he couldn't share. The treasure beneath the oak was not only his secret now, it had become his burden, heavy and complicated. Over the following weeks, the rumors swirled faster. They grew legs and traveled from one home to the next, reaching ears that twisted them further. Melvin found himself under quiet scrutiny each time he entered town. Even Tara heard the whispers, though she refused to voice the mix of emotions they stirred inside her: envy, regret, and a faint spark of hope that he might reach for her again, despite everything. And then suspicion turned into strategy. Derek began sending his associates near the workshop under the guise of buying firewood or furniture. They watched the place closely, noting the tools, the upgrades, the increasing number of workers. They asked questions that seemed harmless, but were far too precise. How often Melvin went into the woods, how far, what he brought back. They observed his movements like hunters tracking prey. Melvin began noticing them. A stranger leaning too casually against a tree near the workshop. Someone walking past his stall twice in the same hour, eyes fixed not on the furniture, but on his face. A man pretending to inspect a stack of wood while actually peering inside the shop's back room. The unease grew, like vines crawling up from the roots of his life, threatening to choke the air he breathed. It became clear that Derek's suspicions had hardened into conviction. He believed Melvin had something worth taking, and if he believed it, he would not stop. But Melvin refused to be intimidated. He met each day with the same steady resolve. He continued his work, continued helping Chris and Aaron learn the craft, continued offering fair prices in the market. He did not let fear dictate his choices. Yet, every night, when he walked into the forest toward the oak tree's buried secret, a gnawing worry crept into his chest. The peace he once found beneath the branches now came with a shadow. If anyone followed him, if anyone dug where they shouldn't, if anyone saw what lay beneath the soil, the life he was building could unravel faster than it had begun. He stood one cold evening in the clearing, the oak towering above him in its ancient stillness. The frost glimmered on the bark, and the ground was hard beneath his feet. He rested his hand against the trunk, feeling the rough texture scratch against his palm, grounding him. He whispered a silent promise in his mind. He would protect this secret, not for greed, but because the treasure was no longer about wealth. It had become the foundation of something greater, a second chance offered to him unexpectedly, a chance to build a life rooted not in poverty, but in purpose. As he turned back toward the workshop, unaware that the wind carried the sound of footsteps not far behind him, he sensed that the piece he had managed to build was reaching its limit. The storm, hinted at in rumors and whispered suspicions, was gathering, and he would soon face the man who intended to tear down everything he had created. But Melvin had weathered hardship all his life. He did not yet know how deep the conflict would cut, but he did know this. He would not surrender the life he had fought to build, not to envy, not to greed, and certainly not to Derek Hollis. Winter loosened its hold on the land with slow reluctance. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing dark, damp earth beneath it, and the forest released the scent of thawed pine and returning life. Yet, even as the cold diminished, a different chill settled over Melvin's days, one that had nothing to do with the season's end and everything to do with the men who watched him from shadows they pretended not to occupy. The rumors had reached a fevered hum. Derek's eyes were everywhere, and the quiet rebirth Melvin had crafted with steady hands was now threaded with an undercurrent of danger. The first sign of escalation arrived not in the form of confrontation, but in what was missing. Chris showed up one morning with a hesitant expression and confessed that the night before, someone had approached his younger brother in town, asking pointed questions about the workshop: how many tools they had, what hours they worked, who came and went. Aaron later told Melvin he had noticed unfamiliar men lingering on the ridge near the forest's edge, pretending to inspect their wagon wheel while keeping an unwavering gaze fixed on the workshop's door. Neither Chris nor Aaron understood the significance, but Melvin did. He felt it with the certainty of a man who knew what greed could drive another man to do. He tried not to let fear guide him. Fear had never served him in the past. It had only weakened him during times when he needed strength most. And yet, he could not deny the creeping sense that the world he'd built, honest, fragile, and precious, might soon be tested in ways he had not prepared for. Each night, he stood outside the workshop, staring into the forest, listening for footsteps that did not belong, wondering how many days remained before Derek made his move. One evening, as the lantern light flickered soft gold against the workshop's wooden walls, Melvin finished sanding a chair leg and stepped back to examine his handiwork. Chris had already gone home, and Aaron had left an hour earlier to help his mother with supper. The silence was the kind Melvin usually welcomed, the silence of completion, of earned rest, but tonight it pressed too deeply into his thoughts. He set down the piece of sandpaper and stretched his stiff back, his bones protesting the long hours he had spent bent over his work. Then he extinguished the lanterns, one by one, and stepped out into the crisp night. The moon hung high, casting pale silver over the clearing. Melvin locked the workshop door and slipped the key into his pocket. He took a slow breath, letting the cool air clear the dust from his lungs. Then, instead of turning toward his shelter, he walked along the narrow path that led deeper into the woods. It was a path he had walked in daylight many times, but rarely at night. Tonight, he needed to feel the ground beneath his feet and reassure himself that the forest, at least, remained unchanged. It was the forest that had given him the treasure, the forest that had sheltered him when no one else had offered refuge. Now, as danger loomed near, he sought its steady presence once more. The trees whispered as he passed, their branches creaking softly in the wind. He approached the great oak that had birthed his new beginning. The tree stood tall, an immovable monument to survival. It dwarfed the smaller trees around it, its bark bearing deep grooves like wrinkles carved by centuries. Melvin paused in front of it, resting his palm against the rough surface. The oak seemed colder tonight, its shadows deeper. For the first time since discovering the treasure, Melvin felt a flicker of unease, an instinct that told him the secret buried beneath the soil might soon be threatened. He knelt, brushing aside the thin layer of frost that had reformed over the burial spot. Nothing had been disturbed. The earth lay quiet, still hiding the truth that Derek was so desperately searching for. Yet Melvin knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion turned into action. Derek was not a man who accepted uncertainty. He was a man who took what he wanted, even if he had to tear it from someone else's hands. For several minutes, Melvin stayed there beneath the ancient oak, letting the stillness settle his thoughts. When he finally stood and turned back toward the workshop, the night seemed darker than before. His steps slowed slightly as he sensed movement far behind him. Quiet, cautious, almost imperceptible. But the forest muffled sound so easily that he couldn't be sure if he was imagining things. He moved faster, unwilling to test whether the shadows held more than just trees. Early the next morning, Melvin arrived at the workshop before the sun had risen. The frost on the ground glittered faintly in the gloom, but as he approached the door, something strange caught his eye. The latch was crooked, tilted in a way it hadn't been the night before. His stomach tightened. He moved closer. The wood around the lock bore faint scrape marks, as though someone had tried to pry it open. The attempt had failed due to the iron reinforcements he had installed weeks earlier, but the message was clear. Someone had been here. When Chris and Aaron arrived later, Melvin chose not to alarm them. He simply said they should double-check the locks at night and keep tools stored away each evening. Chris looked puzzled, while Aaron gave a brief nod, but neither pressed for details. Melvin appreciated their restraint. He needed time to think, to understand how far Derek was willing to go. Over the next several days, the tension escalated. The men Derek sent grew bolder, wandering closer to the workshop under flimsy excuses, inspecting the wood stacks and examining the furniture as if expecting to find something hidden inside. Derek himself passed by once, offering Melvin a smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won, who was merely waiting for the moment when his opponent would fall to his knees and reveal everything. Melvin returned the greeting with a polite nod, unwilling to allow fear to sour his expression. He had learned long ago that letting someone see the weight of their intimidation meant surrendering power. And though Melvin had spent most of his life being overlooked, underestimated, and brushed aside, something within him had shifted. He no longer felt like a broken man. He had something worth protecting now. His work, his dignity, the men who relied on him for guidance, and the fragile foundation of a better future he had built with his own hands. Still, strength alone could not stop the inevitable. Derek was not a man to be deterred by subtle failure. When his attempts at covert observation yielded nothing, he made his next move. A hasty, reckless, and desperate gamble to force the truth out of Melvin. It happened on a night when the wind howled through the forest like a wounded creature. The workshop, sturdy though it had become, rattled beneath the gusts, and the trees outside swayed violently. Chris and Aaron had left early, wary of the storm, leaving Melvin alone to finish sanding the tabletop he'd been working on all week. The lantern light flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like uneasy spirits. When he stepped out into the night, the cold slapped him hard, biting through his shirt. He braced himself and began walking toward his shelter. The wind carried the scent of rain, sharp and metallic, and he quickened his pace, eager to reach cover before the storm broke. He made it only halfway across the clearing. A sharp crack echoed, too heavy to be a branch snapping in the wind. Melvin froze. For a split second, the world held its breath. Then he heard footsteps, multiple pairs, emerging from behind the workshop. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing against the darkness. Shapes moved like shadows, 3 men approaching with deliberate steps. He recognized 2 of them from the market. The third, broader in build and carrying himself with a confidence that stank of superiority, could only be Derek. The storm wind roared behind them, but Derek's voice cut through it, sharp and smug. Melvin did not need to hear the words to know what Derek wanted. The treasure. The truth. The power he believed had been stolen from him. Derek took a step forward, his face twisted with greed thinly disguised as righteous accusation. His men flanked him, each gripping something, a crowbar, a heavy stick, perhaps a knife tucked beneath a coat. This was not a conversation. This was an ambush. Melvin squared his shoulders, his gaze steady. The instinct to run sparked within him, but he forced it down. Running would expose the very secret he needed to protect. And besides, the forest behind him held no guarantee of escape. He faced them with the silent strength he had relied on all his life. Derek spoke, demanding explanations, accusing Melvin of theft, of hiding stolen goods, of cheating the town. His words snarled like wolves circling prey. But behind every accusation lay the truth. Derek was desperate. Desperate men were dangerous, not because they had power, but because they had nothing left but their hunger. Melvin responded with calm refusal. He denied nothing, because there was nothing to deny. He explained nothing, because nothing he said would satisfy a man like Derek. His calm only infuriated Derek further. The storm within the man grew to match the storm in the sky. When Derek lunged forward, his men followed. What happened next blurred into motion. Melvin stepping back, one of Derek's men swinging the crowbar at his shoulder, Melvin dodging only enough to avoid a bone-breaking hit. The storm howled, branches whipped, soil churned beneath their feet. But Melvin refused to fight with the fury of a man defending gold. He fought with the resolve of someone defending his dignity, his future, his workers who depended on him. A shove sent one of Derek's men sprawling into the mud. Another swung wide, the crowbar skimming past Melvin's ribs. Derek made another attempt to tackle him, but Melvin braced himself, letting the man collide against his solid frame before pushing him back with a controlled strength. Though Melvin fought fiercely, he did so carefully. He did not strike to injure, he struck to escape. He needed to end this quickly to prevent anyone from fleeing into the forest, from getting close to the oak, from discovering what lay beneath the soil. But the storm decided the outcome before any of them could. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing for a blinding heartbeat. In that flash of white fire, all 4 men froze as though captured in a photograph. Derek with rage contorting his face, Melvin steady despite the odds, and the storm poised above them like a god ready to deliver judgment. Thunder followed, shaking the earth. The lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting its trunk with explosive force. Fiery splinters erupted, showering the ground. Derek stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear. His men scrambled, shouting, their confidence shattered by the violence of the storm. Melvin stood still, breath heavy, watching them. The storm had saved him from having to choose between fighting and fleeing. Derek shouted something, orders, threats, perhaps curses swallowed by the wind, and then he turned and fled into the darkness, his men scrambling after him. Within moments, they disappeared into the forest, leaving Melvin alone with the thunder, the rain, and the raw adrenaline pumping through his veins. He remained in the clearing for a long time, heart pounding, watching the path Derek had taken. The storm raged, rain soaking through his clothes, grounding him in the reality of what had just unfolded. Derek would not give up. Melvin knew that with absolute certainty. A man like Derek did not retreat. He recalculated. But Melvin also understood something important. He had not been broken, not by poverty, not by rejection, and not by Derek's aggression. He had stood firm, not for the treasure, but for himself. When the storm finally eased, Melvin walked slowly back to his shelter. The forest dripped with rain. The oak tree loomed in the distance, untouched, undisturbed. The treasure remained safe for now, but the battle for his fate had only just begun. Yet, as Melvin crawled beneath the roof he had built with his own hands, exhaustion weighing him down, he understood something with a clarity he had never possessed before. The gold might have sparked Derek's obsession, but it was not gold that had allowed Melvin to stand his ground. It was the strength he had forged through years of hardship, the resilience built from being overlooked, the quiet dignity that came not from wealth, but from the steady work of an honest life. He had never fought for riches. He fought because, for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. And the storm, both outside and within, had proven that no matter what Derek tried next, Melvin would not bend. The storm that had torn across the clearing left behind a world washed clean, though Melvin felt anything but cleansed. The next morning arrived pale and shivering, with patches of mist clinging low to the ground and the forest holding its breath in a tense stillness. Melvin emerged from his shelter slowly, his muscles aching from the confrontation, his ribs sore from where the crowbar had grazed him. Yet it was not the bruises that weighed on him most heavily, it was the knowledge that Derek would return. A man like Derek did not accept defeat, especially one delivered by forces he could neither control nor comprehend. The workshop stood in stubborn silence when Melvin approached, its walls damp from the night's rain, but still holding strong. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of wood shavings, oil, and the lingering hint of smoke from the hearth. The familiarity should have comforted him, yet his mind replayed the storm-lit confrontation with unsettling clarity. He saw again the greed twisting Derek's face, the madness in the man's eyes. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that Derek would not rest until he found what he believed Melvin was hiding. As Melvin began arranging tools on the bench, he paused, noticing the trembling of his own hands. Not from fear, he told himself, but from exhaustion. He had lived through harder moments in his life, poverty, rejection, humiliation, and each had taught him something vital. But now he stood on a precipice unlike any he had faced before. For decades, his life had been small and contained, defined by the limitations placed upon him by circumstance and the harsh expectations of others. Now, for the first time, his life had grown large enough to threaten someone else's view of power, and that made him a target. When Chris arrived, his expression shifted instantly upon seeing Melvin's face. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked, stepping inside with concern radiating from him more clearly than the morning light. Melvin hesitated. He did not want to pull the young man into danger, but he also knew that silence could cause more harm than truth. So he told Chris only the parts that mattered, that some men had confronted him, that they believed he possessed something valuable, and that it was no longer safe to assume the workshop stood beyond the reach of their intent. Chris listened with wide, worried eyes, his jaw tightening as he realized the implication. "Do you want me to stay away? I can—" "No," Melvin interrupted gently. "You're not in danger here as long as you stay aware. And I need help. We can't pause the work now." He placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. "But if things feel wrong, you leave immediately. Do you understand?" Chris nodded, though the fear did not disappear from his face. Aaron arrived shortly after and received a nearly identical warning. Both young men stayed close to Melvin that morning, as though proximity alone could shield him from the growing tension that hung heavy in the air. They worked quietly, each fully aware that the peace in the workshop felt more fragile than before. Outside, the forest seemed to listen as the tools moved softly within. By midday, news of the storm's destruction had spread through the market. People talked about the lightning strike that had split a tree in half. They talked about the thunder that had sounded like the mountains themselves were being torn apart. And some talked about seeing Derek limping into town, drenched, angry, and bruised. His men whispered with agitation, their expressions volatile. But no one knew what had truly happened in the darkness. That evening, Melvin returned to the great oak with cautious steps. The forest floor sparkled with lingering rain, and the wind carried a faint scent of fresh earth. When he reached the tree, he knelt as he had countless times before. The soil was untouched, undisturbed. The treasure remained buried, still hidden from the world that would tear it apart if given even a hint of its existence. He knelt there for a long time, longer than usual, his thoughts heavy but orderly. He had survived the storm and Derek's attack, but survival was not victory. It was a momentary reprieve, a pause before the next inevitable conflict. And yet, as he placed his hand against the ancient bark, he realized something had changed within him. The treasure he'd once viewed as a miracle had become something else, an anchor, yes, but also a burden. He needed to decide what kind of life he wanted to shape from the chance that fate had handed him. The following weeks passed with uneasy calm. Derek did not approach him again, but Melvin could sense the eyes still watching, still measuring the distance between curiosity and violence. Yet, during this fragile quiet, something else began to grow. The workshop gained momentum, not because of the rumors, but because people began to see what Melvin had built with their own eyes. His tables, shelves, and chairs found homes not only in the town, but in the neighboring villages. Word spread that the man in the forest made furniture that lasted, that had soul woven into the grain. Farmers came to him for repairs. Families commissioned pieces to pass down to their children. The workshop expanded its reputation with each passing day, as steady and natural as a river carving a deeper course. Melvin hired 2 more workers, older men laid off from the factory in the next town over. They brought experience and gratitude, their hands rough with the history of labor. Working alongside them, Melvin felt something unfamiliar. Pride not in wealth, but in leadership, in the chance to give others the stability he had fought so hard to gain. And still, the treasure slept beneath the roots of the oak. It was during these weeks that Tara returned. She appeared early one morning, before even Chris arrived. Melvin saw her standing near the edge of the clearing, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her posture hesitant. The years had softened her features, not with gentleness, but with regret. She approached quietly, as though afraid her footsteps might shatter the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a softness he had not heard in years. She apologized, not only for the night she thrust him out into the cold, but for every harsh word said in anger, for every moment of contempt she had shown him when he deserved compassion instead. Her eyes glistened with sincerity, and for the first time, Melvin realized how much weight she too had carried: guilt, shame, and the quiet knowledge that she had abandoned a man who had done nothing but try. He listened with stillness, not from indifference, but from the understanding that words like these were hard-won. When she finished, she did not ask for forgiveness, only for the chance to stand before him honestly, without the bitterness that had once clouded her. Melvin answered softly, not with anger, but with truth. He told her that he had forgiven her long before this day, not because he was noble, but because holding on to pain had once drowned him, and letting go had allowed him to rise. Yet he also confessed that their paths had diverged too far to reconnect. He wished her well, and she accepted his words with quiet grief, offering a final nod before turning back toward the town. He watched her walk away without resentment, feeling not the ache of loss, but the calm of closure. Spring arrived gradually, each new bloom signaling the land's return to life. With the thaw came renewed demand for firewood and furniture, and Melvin's workshop thrived. His workers earned steady wages. Chris saved enough to help his family move into a better home. Aaron began designing small furniture pieces of his own. The older men regained a sense of usefulness they had long missed. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the workshop's windows, Derek appeared in the doorway. The sight of him brought the room to a standstill. Chris froze mid-swing with his mallet. Aaron paused his sanding. The older men exchanged uneasy glances. Melvin looked up from the workbench. Derek stood with his hands empty, his posture stiff and strangely subdued. His face, once contorted with arrogance, held something new. Fatigue, perhaps, or the remnants of a pride shattered in the storm. He entered the workshop cautiously, glancing at the tools but making no move toward them. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual venom. He admitted, in halting words, that he had gone too far, that he had let envy twist him into something despicable, that he had never imagined Melvin could succeed honestly. But now, seeing with his own eyes what the workshop had become, he understood something about the man he had tried to destroy. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not pretend he had changed. But he acknowledged defeat, and that alone was enough. Melvin regarded him with measured calm. He did not offer a handshake, nor did he call for Derek to leave. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that neither excused nor condemned, but closed the ledger of conflict between them. Derek departed, and with him went the shadow that had hung over the workshop for months. But conflicts leave marks. The workers exhaled in relief, yet Melvin felt a deeper lesson settle within him. Secrets held power, but truth held responsibility. The treasure beneath the oak had nearly destroyed him before it could help him, and he knew at last that its future needed clarity. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, staining the sky in muted golds and purples, Melvin walked alone toward the ancient oak. He knelt by its roots and uncovered the small buried cache. The bag was still there, its leather cracked, the coins within untouched. He held the treasure in his hands and felt its weight not as temptation, but as memory. He carried the bag into the workshop and spent the night sorting each coin, each piece of jewelry. He cleaned what he could, studied the markings, and understood something profound. None of this belonged solely to him. It belonged to time, to history, to the land that had sheltered it, to the people who needed more than he ever would. So he made a choice. Over the next months, Melvin used the treasure not to enrich himself, but to enrich the community. He invested in repairing the town's aging school building, purchasing new tools for local apprentices, funding a small free workshop where anyone could learn carpentry. He bought grain for struggling families, paid for medicine for elderly neighbors, repaired homes before winter returned. He did it quietly, never attaching his name to the acts. People noticed anyway. And then, with the last remaining portion of the treasure, he built a community center on the land beside his workshop. Its doors open to everyone regardless of age, status, or circumstance. He named it the Oak Hall, not after himself, but after the tree that had changed his life, a symbol of resilience, endurance, and the roots that bound a community together. Years passed, and Melvin's name became synonymous not with wealth, but with generosity, leadership, and quiet strength. His workshop expanded into a training place where young people learned skills that would sustain them throughout their lives. The town's economy flourished, fueled by a network of craftspeople and laborers who found their footing because one man chose to rise and take them with him. People often speculated about how he had built so much from so little. Some said it was luck. Some said it was a hidden inheritance. A few old rumors resurfaced from time to time, but most people had long since decided the truth didn't matter. What Melvin gave the world mattered far more than how he acquired the means to do it. But Melvin knew. And every now and then, when the leaves rustled a particular way or the wind carried the faint scent of ancient earth, he would walk to the oak and rest his hand against its bark, feeling not the weight of hidden treasure, but the legacy of what he had built from it. In the end, Melvin's life was not transformed by the gold he found, but by the man he became in the years that followed. Wealth had given him opportunity, but character had given him purpose. And the people who once overlooked him now looked to him with a respect he never sought but deeply cherished. The treasure had been a beginning, but the true riches lay in the hands he taught, the families he helped, and the community he uplifted. And long after Melvin was gone, long after the shop's tools passed into younger hands, long after the town grew beyond the boundaries he once knew, the oak still stood, deep-rooted, strong, and eternal, a silent witness to the life of a man who proved that true fortune is never measured in gold, but in goodness. Before you go, make sure you hit subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Watch the next stories on the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support keeps these stories alive. So, click subscribe and tell us where you're watching from.